Hi, this is Doug Dockery. I'm Chair of Environmental Health and a long-term investigator with the Six City Study. And I'm here with my colleagues Frank Speizer and Jim Ware, and we're going to have a conversation about our work in the Six City Study. And actually, Frank, maybe you'd start out by telling us a little bit about the origins of the study.
Yes, sure. In 1973, the Office of Management and Budget asked David Rahl, who was head of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, to put together a committee to review what would happen if a major segment of the country was exposed to higher levels of pollution due to the fact that they had previously mined and had prepared 5 years of coal fossil fuel to heat the country. And as part of that review, Ben Ferris and myself testified before this committee, and we were asked what we would do as epidemiologists to look at the problem. It subsequently became, our comments and our report subsequently became part of the Federal Register in their report, and indeed we were asked to put together a grant application that would be appropriate for looking at the problem. Fortunately, that grant application was reviewed by a special committee, and indeed that was sort of how we got started in the study. At the time, there was a network of air monitoring network throughout the country, which unbeknownst to us, was being dismantled by decisions made in the Office of Management and Budget. And so we had to, in fact, do our own monitoring, and that turned out to be fortuitous for us, because that's what brought on Jack Spengler to work with us on the air monitoring side.
And myself.
And you. Well, that's right. You originally came as an air monitoring person, but we got you into other things.
But, we spent 4 or 5 years collecting data, and Jim then joined the faculty. When was that, in 1978?
79.
79.
That I was fortunate in that there was a lot of hard work that had gone into those first 5 years of work, of data collection and planning, and tremendous. Already the study was well along when I came along, but very little in the way of analysis and reporting had been done, because we were still in the kind of the startup phase. And so I tell Frank that I very vividly recall when I came to Harvard to interview, and Yvonne Bishop, who had been the statistician on the Six City Study, left to go to the Energy Administration. And so there was then a need for a new statistical colleague. And so I interviewed with Frank. And as it happened, I had been working on how to analyze repeated measures. When I was at the NIH, I worked with Manning Feinlieb, and he would always say things like, well, if we had blood pressure measurements in childhood, how could we figure out if a child would be a hypertensive adult? Things like that. So I was interested in the life course and how biomarkers change over the course of your life. And so when I met with Frank, he started putting up the classic figures showing the growth and decline of pulmonary function, how cigarette smoking might impact it, and so on. And my eyes just got as big as saucers, because it was exactly the sort of problem I was interested in. And so with tremendous enthusiasm, I said, yes, I'd love to be part of this. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me. It was really the transformative event in my career, being part of the Six City Study.
Wait a minute. How did you get actually connected with Frank? I think it was Fred Mosteller.
Fred, who, then Frank would like to, I'm sure we'll have something to say about Fred, who had transformed biostatistics at the Harvard School of Public Health and was in the midst of a tremendous build-up and recruitment effort to bring new energy to the department. And so Frank, I think, and Fred had conversations.
Yeah, we had a conversation before your arrival, and it was pretty apparent that Fred was changing the way the biostatistics department was going to operate. I mean, prior to Fred's coming over, it was very much a consultative service rather than a collaborative service. And those are subtle words, but they make big difference in how involved the statisticians became in the actual day-to-day research activity. And Fred really did want to have someone who would come in and be part of the team rather than simply answer questions as a consultant. And that's really what we were after when we.
Well, you
when I
remind me,
interviewed.
I spent 2 days a week
Yeah,
over
right.
over on the 13th floor,
Right.
and spending hours upon hours talking with you and Doug and Jack and the postdocs, and I mean we had a real community there,
Yeah.
and it wasn't like a consultative. It really was part of the team. It was a fabulous experience.
Well, we were dealing with difficult issues, understanding growth of pulmonary function and decline of pulmonary function, and challenging statistical analytical issues that I don't think had been well explored at that point.
I thought we so carefully characterized and modeled the growth and decline of pulmonary function. I always have felt a little disappointed that our models haven't been more widely embraced, that people have stayed with the simpler models, whereas I think we had a much deeper insight into the sort of the distribution of,
Yeah, I agree.
of pulmonary function over the life course.
And it really pointed to this whole concept of the early determinants
Yeah.
of adult disease, and it's some of the work I'm most proud of what we did in terms of understanding the growth and decline of lung function.
And it was the foundation for all the work we did on exposures then, because
Right.
knowing what you might call be able to describe normal behavior, then you can look at perturbations.
So then there was a lot of investigations looking at indoor exposures to pollution,
Yeah.
nitrogen oxides, passive smoke, exploring the exposure data in a lot of detail. I mean, you played a critical role in most of those papers.
One of the papers that I really liked was the paper about the effects of cigarette smoking, and it showed how we were able to show that when you smoke, there's a burden of pulmonary function loss, sort of that's linear in the number of cigarettes you smoke, and when you stop smoking, your rate of decline of pulmonary function returns to that of a healthy person, but you have a deficit that you don't recover. So I thought that was such a elegant summary of how cigarette smoking affects the lung in terms of pulmonary function. So yeah, it was another example of the sort of work you're talking about.
Yeah. And in terms of a life course issue, the fact that we could show that in teenagers as well, teenagers who took up smoking did never reach their maximums and indeed started to decline earlier. And that was important.
But the critical paper probably was the mortality paper that eventually was published in 1993, but I think we first had the results in 1990 showing that increased mortality in the communities. And that was illuminating in many respects in helping us understand the structure of the data, that we had effectively six points that we were dealing with, and rather than the 8,000 adults in our study. But I think the clarity of the results there was very impressive.
Yeah, I think you and Frank really understood the policy significance of that. That it's one thing to say that there might be short-term variation in mortality associated with air pollution episodes, but to see that there's a cumulative effect and a net acceleration of mortality in communities that are exposed to higher air pollution environments was just absolutely moved the conversation down the road in terms of policy implications.
Yeah, it was a game changer for sure, and certainly raised our visibility on the policy side, and raised a lot of critics came out of the woodwork. I guess I remember very well when we started the study, Frank made the point that we had to be absolutely sure about every result and have a lot of armor built up. What, I mean, that was based on the experience with the chest studies, in fact. With
Yes, I
EPA.
mean it was a hostile environment. We would go and give testimony to the Clean Air Science Advisory Committee, and there would be industry people there, and they would, hammer away at us. And so clearly, it was a very different environment than pharmaceutical research, which I've done a lot of in my career, because there's a more of a common shared interest in pharmaceutical research, where in air pollution research it's adversarial, that the generators are trying to limit the adverse impact on their companies and on their business models.
So let me ask you, do you remember Monday, October 2nd, 1989?
Yes, we were called to the dean's office because there had been an allegation that we had manipulated and misrepresented our data, and that we were engaged in some sort of scientific fraud. And you and I went to the dean's office, where we met with the dean and the associate dean for academic affairs and the university general counsel, and they told us that we were under investigation and that our data sets were going to be impounded and put in locked rooms, and we would only be able to access them under supervision. And so you reminded me that initially we thought that would just be for a few weeks, but it was almost a year that we were unable to access in an unfettered way our research data, because we were in the midst of this ongoing investigation.
Yes, I mean, we of course said, well, we take this seriously and we'll be happy to cooperate with this investigation, and in fact sent 17 big boxes of data down to NIH and ended up locking up all our data. But as you said, what was supposed to take a few months ended up taking over a year before we could actually get back to analyzing our data. It had a tremendous impact on our productivity.
Well, this is, and I think Frank, you mentioned Frank's statement about how we had to be above reproach, and I think, Doug, you were so exemplary, and we had such strong data management people that we were able to withstand. That was a big challenge with the tremendous quantity of data that we had, to be able to really respond in a focused and correct way to these very specific questions about the accuracy of our data. That was a non-trivial task and involved many, many years of preparatory work to be able to do that. So thank goodness that we were able to withstand that.
Yeah, it was Martha Fay and Sue Briggs and all the other staff working on this. So this came back to revisit us in 1997 after the six-city study, mortality study came out, and EPA proposed a new standard for particles based in large part on that study. But then there were demands for access to the data, increasing pressure to release the individual records of people in the study. You were dean at that time, and you had to help us guide how we were going to respond to those outside pressures and those demands.
Yes, it was fortunate that we were able to partner with an organization that was duly sponsored by the government and by industry, so that it was seen as a more neutral party in these concerns. And they recruited Dan Krusky and his colleagues from Canada, who were very accomplished investigators, who did an exhaustive reanalysis and quality assurance effort to assess the six cities data set, and in the end came to the conclusion that our findings were essentially, they were always little tweaks about how you do things, but essentially replicated what we had reported.
And I think it's important to point out that, in fact, the Health Effects Institute conducted, it's really an open competition for the opportunity to do this reassessment. And indeed, they chose the Canadian group that eventually did the analysis, and I think that was important.
Well, even more than that, we agreed to turn over all the data to them
yes.
without any restrictions
Right.
and make all the records available. And so at that time, they came back and looked at records that we had collected 25 years previously, and
To do
again,
validations, yeah.
going into the original records, opening the original questionnaires, and checking them against the data we used. And, you know, I don't think you never know what's going to turn up when you look back over 20, 25 years earlier, what might have been there. But fortunately, I think because of the good quality control and the good records we had, it did turn out very positively. But I certainly suffered from a lot of anxiety as we went through that process over, it must have been over a year or two also.
Well, yes.
Where are the origins of the recognition of the importance of data integrity? That's not a routine thing in science, and so many people do it well, but many people don't do it well. How did it come to pass that the six-city study took that issue so seriously from day one?
Well, I think that part of that related back to the chess studies, in which Ben and I were involved in some of the critiques of some of that work, and we went to some of the sites where some of the work was done. And it was clear that honest mistakes were made. I don't think there was nothing nefarious about it, but it was clear that people, when we asked questions about some of the documentation, the information wasn't there. And so I think it was very important right from the get-go that we knew that we were in sort of this potentially hostile environment, and right from the beginning we thought that it was important to be able to do this documentation. And in fact, part of the reason that Professor Dockery is not a meteorologist anymore, but a environmental epidemiologist, was because we needed someone to take that role on in a very important way. I don't remember the specific discussions we had about it, but that was the area where you had to take over.
Right. I mean, it was trying to bring on good quality controls that we had in the exposure side of this to the same level in the measurement of lung function and parameters of symptoms and so forth.
Yeah.
So,
Well, we ought to also acknowledge our colleague Jack Spengler, because you mentioned that it was in a way an opportunity that we had to build our own air pollution monitoring system, because network, because that then created an environment where they could be very innovative, and all the work on fine particles, and particularly the PM 2.5, and to recognize that that was the right question, and to develop the technology to collect the PM 2.5. I can remember Jack's talks about the equipment that they had to build and design and so on, and how it turned out to be the right choice in terms of identifying the high-risk part of the air pollution composite.
well, it's interesting. The title of the grant originally was the respiratory effects of sulfur oxides and respirable particles. So there was a recognition early on that it was that fine fraction, but we didn't have ways of measuring it at that time.
Yeah.
And Jack was instrumental in developing those methods. I wanted to maybe turn a little bit to, you've since gone on to look at other contentious areas, specifically in lead, and thinking about the treatment of lead-exposed children, the TLC trial. That was a randomized clinical trial, and probably the first one to use that approach to look at an environmental agent.
Yes, the head of NIEHS, Ken Olden, was African American, and he knew that African American children were highly represented in the children exposed to environmental lead, and he was committed to do that study, even though there was tremendous opposition, because many people felt, and by the way, the TLC, or treatment of lead-exposed children trial, was a trial of treatment with an oral agent, succimer, of kids who'd been exposed and had elevated blood leads. And it's interesting that with Flint now, we have Flint, Michigan, we have a reemergence of the fact that still in this country there are many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of children that are living in environments where they're exposed to lead. So the question was, if children do have an exposure to lead, can you protect them from the ill effects by treating and chelating the lead from their bodies? And so it was a large trial, a carefully designed randomized trial, and it showed that, in fact, it was not effective in terms of effects on cognition and development. That I've always interpreted that study as showing that by the time you identify the child who's been exposed to lead, they've already had an exposure, and the effect you can have on the sort of total burden of exposure is relatively small fraction of the total, and the damage has been done. So that I always thought it was a message about public health. We have to prevent exposure, not treat exposed children. So the study was negative, and it put some people out of business that were chelating kids really with no measurable benefit. So that was a big effort. You and I together led that effort from the coordinating center point of view, and I think it was a real contribution.
But it was also a natural development of your work on longitudinal methods and thinking about how to look at the development of cognitive function in
That's
these
right.
kids.
Yes, because we enrolled kids at 18 months to 3 years, I believe it was, and then followed them for 3 years to see when they got to an age where you could more accurately measure, get more accurate measures of development and scores on the Bailey scales and such things, and the WIPSI and the other measures that are used for placing kids on in terms of cognitive development. And so that was a rewarding part of that study too. I mean, that field has exploded so much now, but we were fortunate that we came into that work at a time, my colleague Nan Laird and I, at a time when computing was beginning to have the power to open the doors to a completely new class of methods that were computationally intensive. And Nan had a wonderful background in the EM algorithm and empirical Bayes and things, and so we were able to really make an impact there and carried that over into the TLC study.
Well, I think there's a common theme here that you've really taken challenging problems in environmental health, practical problems, and really developed innovative analytic methods to address those problems, to really reveal what the underlying message is.
Yesterday I had the opportunity to go to a celebration of Frank's 80th birthday, and Frank asked somebody, I think maybe it was Ed Silverman, asked people, who are the epidemiologists in the room? I didn't put my hand up. I am not an epidemiologist, but I love to really engage with the substance of a medical or an epidemiologic problem and take advantage of the expertise of my colleagues who help me frame the statistical question. And that's, I think, the part of my career I've enjoyed most is working really closely at the interface between the medical or public health problem and the statistical methodology that can be helpful. And the Six Cities study was such a blessing because it was such a rich, fertile ground for that kind of work. And you mentioned before the kind of work we did on modeling pulmonary function, modeling the frequency of respiratory diseases, and understanding the risk factors and the mediators. I mean, it was just so much fun to come to work and to be involved in that.
Well, the group that you sort of started has continued, and to the degree that starting off that kind of work has led to other people who want to engage in environmental statistics, it has been a very important addition, I think, to the field of biostatistics.
Well, and we've been fortunate in our department to have a number of people that have really taken that work to the next level. And Francesca Dominici and Brent Kuhl and Louise Ryan when she was here. We've had a strong commitment to environmental health and a really close relationship with
Indeed.
your department, Doug, over the years, and it's been wonderful for us. And it's been part of our department is blessed because we have strong engagement in a number of areas. Of course, HIV. We run the National Statistical Data Center for AIDS Clinical Trials, the ACTG. We run several cooperative groups at the Dana-Farber in cancer, and then we have environmental health. Those are the three. Until recently, those were the three legs of the stool. Now we see, and we heard about this yesterday too, we see the move into population genetics, into big data problems, and our field is really changing. But still, you can see its origins in the work that has happened over the last 20 years.
Well, it's really, as we started, Fred Mosteller had such an influence in changing the direction, setting this towards practical solutions and trying to use that as a basis for developing the biostatistics department here. And I think we're seeing the fruits of that.
Yeah, we're blessed to be working in such an interesting environment with so many wonderful colleagues and such a tremendous exploding the pace of discovery. It's just exhilarating.
Well, it has been exhilarating, and it's been also influential and consequential in terms of what we've been able to accomplish. And it's been a real pleasure to work with you and Frank and all the other members of the team, and thank you very much.
Thank you for speaking with us, Doug.
Thank you.